Yeah, or WhatsApp.
Hey, Jeff.
Hello.
How you going?
Good. What yourself?
Yeah, I'm alright.
Yeah. I think we've picked a bad time slot actually because Jay Dyer is streaming right now.
Uh-oh.
Uh, but everybody knows that the real ones, the real nerds, are watching Iron Age Archive.
Yeah, anyone can. Dyer's for the Zoomers. We're
Yeah.
a bit more for the millennials or Gen Xers.
Yeah, I would say maybe we skew a bit more to the Gen Xers.
Well, yeah. I mean, I'm the baby, and I'm not a Gen Xer, so yeah. Well, I mean, this is as much sort of proof of concept as anything else, and yeah. Hopefully, next time, we won't be competing with Jay Dyer. So
And yeah, I think even aside from Dire, there's a couple other streams in our spheres going on right now. So
well, the recording will be up there. So, all right, let's get going then.
oh yeah, but that's one thing we should mention, that our stream today is interactive. People can submit their questions while you lecture through this part
Yeah,
3 of Tragedy and Hope.
yeah. So, and if anyone comes on with any questions from the first 2 episodes as well, we can do that. Take those as well at the end. But yeah, have you been enjoying the first 2 episodes, Jeff?
Is that a question for chat, or is that for that's for me?
Yeah.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, he's enjoyable to think about. He's not that enjoyable to read, but he's a monster. He writes very interesting things in. I don't know if it could be written better, but in a very tedious way. It takes a lot of slogging to get through. There's a reason not a lot of people have read Tragedy and Hope, but this is why we're doing this, so that you don't have to. So yeah, let's get going. So today, episode 3, Russia and the Buffer Fringe. Again, a Bucklander lecture series here on the IAA. Just a little recap. We had economics is the area that the West dominates its growth. Is that going back to the evolution of civilizations? Economics is the way in which we the West grows. That's our instrument of growth. And capitalism is far and away the tool in that economic area that has allowed the growth. It's by far and away our biggest strength, and that's because capitalism largely operates in a sort of self-guiding way. So you can expand, and the market to some extent will be able to adapt and use price mechanisms to a large extent, and people's greed to grow itself. There have been times when the market hasn't been that involved, or there's been times when there's been more market control, but it's always been capitalism to some degree or another over the last 600 years, 800 years. So that's the big thing. This had an ability for the bankers to get incredibly influential. Their bankers are a type of merchant, and the bankers that become the specialist within the bankers are those sort of international finance guys like the Rothschilds. They get a lot of influence. They dictate government policy. They're able to really have a disproportionate influence on everything. And in particular, in this period of 1850 to 1932, again, for Quigley, these sort of periods are a bit fuzzy. To some extent, financial capitalism was already over by 1890. You can see this with the British. The British are sort of ending financial capitalism before anyone else because they were in it from the beginning, before anyone else. The Germans are still doing financial capitalism later. The French are sort of in between those two. The Americans are in between those two. So, in financial capitalism, though, in particular, the bankers have a lot of control, and broadly speaking, it's in that period of 1850 to 1932. After 1932, you get the rise of the manager, which Quigley takes that idea quite heavily from Burnham. Today we're going to do chapters 3 and 4, which is Russia, chapter 3, and then the rest of this is chapter 4: China, Japan, the British Empire, Africa, Ireland, India, and you kind of and in that discussion about the British Empire, you get the shades of the Anglo-American establishment. There's a section towards the end of the book where there's like 20 pages, and it's the most readable and engaging part of Quigley, and he just breaks down the Anglo-American establishment, and it's amazing, and I can't wait to get there, because that's when all the work that we're doing here really starts to pay off. I said to Jeff, I sent him a message saying, a lot of what you're doing with Quigley is you're moving these grains of sand, and then one day you start to begin to see the big picture and what Quigley is doing, and it's hard to describe what that is until you're there. And so I just encourage you guys to stick with it, because everything that like Quigley says is important for this idea, and when it all starts to come together, it's really a big payoff. So the first part is Russia. Russia is an important country for Quigley. He's writing in 1963. The Soviets are still a thing. In fact, the Soviets are at the height of their power, and Quigley's trying to understand. He's not sure. He obviously doesn't know what's going to happen in 30 years, and so he's giving us an account of the other great civilization going on the planet at the time. And Quigley says, Europe had this idea that Russia was part of European civilization, but that this was the wrong idea, and that when he's writing, people are coming to realize Russia is its own civilization. Now, before we talk about Russia, we got to talk about Byzantium. And one of the questions that's very interesting from a Quigley perspective is Byzantium a civilization of its own? Is it the failure? Is it a sort of a failed star? Does it not get enough mass to really form its own civilization? Or is it a remainder of the classical? I think there's reason to think it's both, but it's not super important here, other than to think about Byzantium in general, because of course Russia draws really heavily on it, and so Russia is this composite of three groups. The Byzantium, the Slavic people who make up the base of the population, and then the Viking overlords that conquer Russia. And so what happens is the Viking overlords come in, they conquer the Slavs, and they look to Byzantium for their culture and their religion, and they take it on. And this is broadly what the Russian civilization is. This composite of these these three groups, but they're still very distinguished from one another in a way that they're not in other civilizations. In the way that the West sort of is Germanic and classical, but blended together. Russia is not that. Russia is the components that make up Russia are still, and this is true in every area. We're going to see this in a minute. They're very defined from one another, and they very much maintain that identity. So, again, the largest impact was Byzantium, and from that impact, from Byzantium, came the ancient Greek notion of a totalist state. This isn't as bad as it sounds for the ancient Greeks, because what they are is these small polises gathered together that are usually, there's some are democratic, some are tyrannical, but the idea, if you'd gone to an ancient Greek and said, there's a difference between the city and your culture, it would have made no sense to him. The two were the same. One second, something's going on. I just have to, I'll be 10 seconds.
If I had to guess, it's probably food delivery. But we'll ask him when he gets back.
I'd left the tap running and it was driving me crazy.
Oh, okay. My guess was food delivery.
No. I've already had my stew of organ meat, my ancestral power foods of liver and heart. So I'm good. I needed the power for this lecture. So there's no distinction between those two ideas, and this is weird for us, because our civilization had this experience of the state collapsing and discovering that society could go on without it. That our society was preserved in the monasteries, in the little burgs. And the state very much forms around society. Russia is not like this. Russia, with this idea from the ancient world, is not able to distinguish between state and society, state and culture. And there's this problem with the Russian civilization. It kind of produces like a schizophrenic character because of this. And on the one hand, things remain very polarized and very separated from one another. But the Russian character is trying to bridge these divides and trying to homogenize into a single state. And it's always sort of trying to mix oil and water. And the elements that it's always trying to combine are very separate from one another. Western Europe is much more of a spectrum. And it doesn't have these sort of worries that Russia does because of this formation. So that ancient philosophy, that ancient Greek philosophy, he's thinking about Plato to a large extent. It really forms the sort of the Russian political character. And the other thing to keep in mind is Russia wobbles between these states of being very powerful and very weak. And it's a very odd position for a civilization to be in. Russia is one of those civilizations that is an entire state. It doesn't have the problem that Western, or perhaps you might want to say the benefit that Western civilization has of being divided amongst multiple nations. Russia is a single nation, and it's a single It's sort of a single people, and it's a single civilization. But Russia's just sort of getting going, and the Mongols show up. And this is very problematic for, again, Russia. It's and it's very part of this sort of this sense of vulnerability that Russia has. The other tension that's going on in Russia, in a similar way to the Mongols to a large extent, is this problem of should we Westernize, or are we rather opposed to the West? And you get this big conflict reoccurring throughout Russian history between those who are pro-Western and those who are the Slavophiles. So Peter the Great is pro-Western. Ivan the Terrible is a Slavophile. You might want to say that Tsar Nicholas is pro-Western, and that Lenin is a Slavophile. And these things recur very often. There's a pro-West. I mean, I think Peter the Great. Peter the Great's pro-Western. I apologize. I don't know the details of the Russian monarchy and the order it goes through, but there's very much this wobble back and forth. But this also happens. This also happens at a cultural level and at a religious level. This is very interesting, though, because Russia is not able to self-industrialize. It is very dependent upon the West, and this includes the Soviets. And I have this little reference to Anthony Sutton. I don't know how far Sutton actually goes with this, but there is a reading of Russian history that says the Soviets are controlled opposition. That is probably one of my spiciest takes, like my most sort of conspiratorial takes. Like, wait a minute, you mean for 70 years, 75 years, the Soviet Union was controlled opposition for the West?
That seems to be what Sutton implies as well. That the revolution was certainly backed by American bankers, and then maybe during Stalin's reign, that relationship between Western banking and the Soviets was a little bit more contentious.
Well, you say that, but Sutton is writing up into the 60s. I mean, I think he publishes in like the 70s, and he covers up into the early 60s. He covers well into Stalin's reign, and he says that like well into Stalin's reign, they're very dependent upon us for just about everything they have, and
right.
So I don't know that it ends, and I've heard things that go, we were still sending we were still building factories in Russia in like the 70s and the 80s, outside of Sutton's set of concerns. And one of the things that really weakens Russia is us opening up China, and us going, okay, you don't want to do this stuff for us anymore, we're going to go to China, because there's always a lot of involvement that we don't know about. It's not talked about much. We think that there's this like very this Iron Curtain divides us entirely. No, there was a lot of economic exchange. Apparently, Lenin had this idea that what the Soviets would do is borrow from the West and pay it back, and then the next time they'd borrow a little bit more and pay it back, and that the West would get comfortable lending them so much money until one day Russia would go, give us a huge amount of money. They would, and then Russia would just not pay it back, and that's one of the ways you'd be able to destroy the West.
Renegade in chat says, yes, the Soviet Union and the United States made one of the most lucrative grain deals of all time to the Americans' benefit.
Renegade, if you know what year that was, just say it in chat because I'd be interested to sort of. I know what you're talking. I vaguely know what you're talking about. The Great Grain was a big part of it, and that's interesting, right? Because Russia's sending us something that has not a lot of value, and somehow Russia's getting things that have a huge amount of value. And this is also Russia's not particularly good at growing grain. Quigley talks about this in a later chapter. So it's a really weird situation. It's very bizarre. Anyway, well, we will be getting to this. I hope to do after we do Quigley. I hope to do maybe a one or two episode thing on Sutton.
And then there's also several writings from American industrialists who are very interested in how the Soviet project will work out. I think David Rockefeller was one of those. I might be misremembering, but he would write these editorials praising what's going well in Russia and very interested in seeing if the Soviet model was the model of the future.
I think Ford is very interested in Russia. This is, so one of the things I have a little bit of, I'll be honest with you guys, one of the things I have a little bit of anxiety about is like with these videos is I don't know everything. And I'm giving you sort of like, I've just read Quigley. I've read other things randomly, but Quigley is, for this series, Quigley is the first thing I've read really systematically with a real purpose for. And I'm really excited about it because I want to read more and I want to put more of that stuff into the systematic framework. And if you're watching this is the beginning. So like, I always worry, like, am I missing something? Well, if I miss it here, and we find something or you find something and you can send it to me, I'm going to plug it in. And this is very much what I'm trying to say is this is very much like a living framework. So anyway, again, the next thing Russia really struggles with is they struggle to put together a functioning parliamentary government. And again, these problems are part of that oil and water problem Russia has. You've got people that are weirdly very pro-democracy, but also ultra tyrannical. In that, like, they think that there should be this like ultra homogenizing process, and that everyone should vote, and that the sort of the guided by this sort of like the mass, and where there's no individual identity, and it's guided by this sort of democratic movement of the mass, but that is also very tyrannical. So it's sort of democracy without the respect for minority rights. I will talk about this in a little bit in a minute. So again, this is exactly what it was: individual versus totality. There's this tradition. I can't remember the word for it. There's this tradition in Russia of like the holy man, who goes and lives out in the woods. The sort of the holy hermit. That has like a cult of personality built up around him. I want to say what I'm saying about Russia is not about orthodoxy. Not anything that Quigley says negative about Russia, I do not take as an attack on orthodoxy.
That is some of that Byzantium influence coming through, isn't it?
Well, I get the impression the Russians have these like holy men, these like I think they're like the group that they represent are the old believers to a large extent. That orthodoxy has, they don't have a place in orthodoxy as such. These guys, and so there's a guy out in Russia who says he's Jesus. There's always some guy in Russia who says he's Jesus, and he's like this weird sort of almost like hybrid Orthodox Pentecostal kind of guy. And there's a good deal of paganism, Slavic spirituality thrown in there. And Rasputin was
Dugin.
well, yeah. Rasputin is a guy is this sort of character. I can't. There is a word for them, and I can't remember what they are. But Rasputin is one of these. So the Russian tendency is this tension, and you have these holy men going out into the woods, and then they come back and they go and like live with the masses. You have like the rich Russians giving up their wealth to go live with people. I think like Dostoevsky did this. I believe Dostoevsky lived intentionally sort of a pure life or a poor life. He was I believe he was an ascetic. Tolstoy, you get this. Tolstoy's a weird guy, and I know a number of Orthodox who don't want anything to do with Tolstoy. Like if you said to them, Tolstoy was Orthodox, they'd go, no, he wasn't. So the Russian character is very weird, and they kind of work themselves towards this anarchy. But again, it's this weird, like, and I'm going to use this word. I'm not using it in the way that it's used about 2023. There's this like anarchy tyranny, anarcho tyranny, where it's sort of, it's a little bit like the Borg, right? You're supposed to lose your identity. You're supposed to be subsumed into this biomass of humanity, and by doing, and this is some because these and this is very much something that comes out of the Slavophile side, because they see this sort of unconscious operating of the serfs. Like the serfs don't have much. It's very condescending. The serfs don't have much of a life, so I'm going to go and live with them, and I'm going to forget these things. And in working hard and in forgetting civilization, I will sort of be purified. And the serfs are like, who are these guys? The serfs are not very receptive of them. But these guys, in doing that, sort of become they start to lose their spirituality, and they start to become atheists. And these are the guys that Quigley says the revolution found such fertile ground in, because they had sort of become disillusioned with spirituality, but they were very much trying to live this sort of lose their identity in the people sort of feeling. And you can see a little bit why orthodoxy is this would come out of orthodoxy. I had an Orthodox priest told me that the view of the Orthodox Church was, and I'm not Orthodox. I have a lot of sympathy for them, and I have a lot to do with them when I get the chance. But he said that the view of the Orthodox Church is that we're damned individually, but we're saved together. And the Orthodox have a much more sense of the church as being something that is saved together, whereas Western Christendom is, once you are saved, you are now in the church, sort of emphasis. Does that make sense?
I've heard comparisons with Noah's Ark, and even the Ark of the Covenant. There's various there's videos online. You can see the comparison between this idea of an ark and the church.
There's more. I don't. Quigley does not talk a lot about the Orthodox Church. the one, so it's sort of a little bit outside this. The one thing he says negative about the Orthodox Church is this like effort to totalitize and homogenize led the Orthodox Church to crack down on the state and Orthodox Church together, to crack down on Lutherans in Finland, Catholics in Poland, and Jews in the Pale. So that's the big thing that he says about orthodoxy in this. But he's
Not
not.
that that's limited to the Orthodox Church, though, right?
He's not saying
that happened
about
between Catholics and Protestants,
Yeah,
and Protestants, etc.
yeah. He's not saying it about. He's not saying about orthodoxy. He's saying it about in this way that Russia is a state and a society at one time. And the other thing that he says is this is happening at a time when this stuff in Europe is like 200 or 300 years in the past. Russia's doing this in like much later. But it's again, Quigley would not disagree with you, Jeff. Quigley would go, yeah. He's not saying this is an attack on orthodoxy. He's saying this as a way to contextualize this sort of Russian effort to totalitize. Now, again, this Western and Slavic poles are very much represented, aligned with French and German philosophy and attitudes. The French are produce a very sophisticated philosophy. When most of the French philosophers that you would think of are actually not representative of French philosophy. Sartre, Camus, those guys are actually very Germanic because they're very influenced by Heidegger. One of the things that happens is, Heidegger he writes Being in Time and it changes everything. And the French sit up and go, wow, and they start paying attention. The other thing that happens is, after the war, Heidegger can't teach in Germany for like 5 years. And the French go, please come and teach us. So he goes over to France and teaches philosophy for 5-10 years because he can't teach in Germany. So modern French philosophy is very formed by Heidegger. Prior to that, it is this sort of it's a very classically Western sort of set of concerns. There's arguments back and forth between England and France. England is more significant in philosophy, but French is more significant in culture. But and the Westerners, very often in Russian families, upper class families, they would be speaking French to one another. They wouldn't speak Russian. I believe Tsar Nicholas and the Emperor, the Tsarina, I can't remember. I believe they would write to one another in French. You hear that sort of stuff. So who is, but the Slavophiles get their philosophical grounding from the Germans, from Nietzsche, from Schelling, from what's his name, the really depressing guy.
I have to be more specific.
No, he is like he's like the depressing German. He's worse than Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer has the reputation of being the most like black-pilled, and Nietzsche. So when you read Nietzsche after Schopenhauer, Nietzsche's like this like celebration of life in this vibrant thing compared to Schopenhauer, partly because he's reacting to Schopenhauer. So yeah, again, as I said, you get these the Slavophiles realizing that like this isn't working, and they lose their spirituality, and they very much they realize, oh, the state is not society, but they don't do it in a way that you would have in the West, where you happen to have this realization that the two are not the same. Instead, it becomes the state is oppressing and making war on society. And again, you can see this would very make very fertile ground for Bolshevism. And all of this makes very confused Russian psyche. And again, as I say, I don't believe this is an attack on orthodoxy on Quigley's part. He's being critical of Russia. And he would say the West functions better than Russia, partly because the West has had a much more stable history. And Russia lives in this very vulnerable position. It's conquered. It is being conquered, or it is conquering. So there isn't. It's a very weird place once you dig into it.
Yeah, you can see how that vulnerability actually leads initially to the state being identified with society, because you need a strong state to protect yourself from your enemies.
That too, yeah, that's a good point. He quickly does say that. I forgot to mention that. It's not just it is not just from the ancient Greeks. It is from its own history that it learns. We have to all be lined up here. There's no room for individual rights when we're being attacked by the Mongols.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's Russia. And now...
And then in Dostoevsky's The Idiot, you can kind of see how in the late 19th century, how Russian aristocrats, or descendants of Russian aristocrats, begin to question their own society, and they begin to see the grass greener on the other side in the West. Yeah. And they start to ask the same questions that Westerners ask. They begin questioning things like authority. Right?
Well, we have this idea that revolutions are from the bottom up. They're not. The French Revolution, the American Revolution, the Russian Revolution, they're led by the upper classes. The upper classes are very involved in those movements. The worst case scenario for the upper classes, they lose control of the revolution, which is what happens to a large extent with the French Revolution. But there were lots of guys in the Russian Revolution who were aristocrats who got a taste for that, and maybe they ended up on the wrong side of a firing squad, but in that sort of pre-Leninist dominant moment, when it was still up for grabs, there are lots of the Russian upper class is very involved with that. And of course, a lot of the Russian upper class is very reactionary. But then so are the peasants. There's a lot of peasants that realize, no, things are not going to be better for us with people who are showing up, just going like, thank you, comrade, give me your grain. Now that's a big part. Russia comes back. Of course, it comes back throughout the book, and Quigley is sort of giving us this as a starting point. Just as episodes 1 and 2 that we did are sort of the starting point for the West, this is a starting point for the other great civilization that's on the planet at the time. What Quigley sees as the other great civilization. But now there's a bunch of other countries, which Quigley calls the buffer fringe, that we're going to look at. And these are countries in Asia and Africa that act as a buffer zone between us and the Soviets, and as the colonies where you do not have a significant amount of white settlers. You have a lot of indigenous people being ruled over by white imperial officers. But the first one is the Ottoman Empire, and so the Ottoman Empire been around for about 500 years at this point. It's all just a mess. It is in this sort of pre-First World War period. It's actually kind of remarkable that the Ottomans are able to put up such a good fight in the First World War, that they don't just topple over. It's constantly being referred to in political cartoons and in writings as the sick man of Europe. The ability for these the Turks to rule over European Christians and Arab Muslims and Jews is just starting to really fray at the edges. This is all in the period of sort of 1850 to 1914, right? This is what Quigley's setting the stage for the First World War. Same with Russia. This is all about Russia. That was all about Russia up till the First World War. You have European powers constantly interfering. They show up, and they're peeling bits of Turkey away from Turkey without asking Turkey. And it's more, will the other powers let me do this? And Russia fights a war with Turkey, not the Crimean War, which the Crimean War, the Russians, the French and British are so worried about an Ottoman collapse that the French and British go and help the Ottomans fight the Russians, because they're aware that if they just let Russia act unopposed, Russia could very quickly make itself into the Third Rome and become the sort of like the champion of the Slavs, and you'd very quickly have things sort of dominoes starting to fall in Europe. So Russia fights this war in, I think it's the 1870s, and they take a lot from the Turks. They give a huge amount of land to Bulgaria. Bulgaria is this client state of Russia. It's become independent already, and it's called the Treaty of San Stefano. And they sign it really, really quickly. And the British and the French just go, no, we're not doing that. And they convene the Congress of Berlin. And the Congress of Berlin, it is what we remember about the Congress of Berlin is the division of Africa. But what initiates the Congress of Berlin is the Treaty of San Stefano, and they're kind of, the British and the French show up, and I hate to put it this way, they cuck the Russians. They like tear up this Treaty of San Stefano, and they go, Russia's not getting all of this. Bulgaria's not getting all of this. You can have this, but we're going to take this, and the British and the French take quite a bit of stuff for themselves. The Italians end up taking a bit in this period as well. And what's important about the Congress of Berlin for the Ottoman Empire is this: Germany takes nothing. And the Ottoman Sultan writes this letter to the Germans saying, thank you. You're the only nation that has not swarmed in on top of us in our moment of weakness. The Germans try to the Germans want to build this Baghdad to Berlin railway. The British do not like this at all. The French are on the fence about it, but they allow themselves to be bought off. The British, too, eventually, through a series of horse trading, allow it. And it's really interesting. What do you mean allow it? The British are the preeminent power in the world. They are able to cut off trade to anyone that has to send anything by ship. And to the extent that they can say to Germany, we're not going to allow you to build a railway in a third party. You're not going to, or through a third party. We're not going to let it happen. This is how much power the British have. And now you might be thinking, now there's generally two ways of hearing that sort of stuff. You either go, those perfidious Brits, they always ruin everything. Or you go, I'm quite sure they had a very good reason, and they were just preserving global stability, because the Brits are only ever on the right side of history. I'll let you guess which one I am. And as I said, you have the beginning of good relations with Germany from the Ottomans. The British Empire will be dealing a lot more in this on this in a later episode, and on the and when we talk about the Anglo-American establishment, which is the first book Quigley writes, and it isn't published until after he dies because no one will publish it. In part because it's very revealing, perhaps, of things that people might not want to be revealed. I think that might be part of it. But the legend of the Anglo-American establishment not being published, it might not all be conspiratorial. It might also be because it's kind of unreadable. Again, it's very difficult to read. But anyway, we'll be talking about it because I've read it for you. Now, as far as the buffer Fringe goes, what Quigley's talking about with regards to the British Empire, South Africa, or Africa, India, and Ireland. He's not talking about Australia, New Zealand, or Canada, because these countries are dominions. They're not really under the same oversight as these other areas. They do factor in later, but they're not very important for the sake. What Quigley, but these to put it in geographic terms, there's a concept called the world island. The British are interested in divide and conquer, and never letting one power get too powerful in Eurasia. There's a geographer, I can't remember his name at the moment, but he develops this idea of the world island. And he says, should anyone ever come to dominate the world island, they'll come to dominate the world. And the world island is sort of Africa, Asia, Europe, that landmass. Africa to an extent, right? North Africa, yeah. And the British are not part of the world island. They're part of the peripheral islands. And it is in the interest of the peripheral islands to divide, to keep Eurasia divided. Because when a power unites in Eurasia, it will become too powerful for the islands to do anything about. So, keep them divided. Quigley doesn't mention this idea, but these countries that Quigley mentions in the Buffer Fringe are part of the world island in a way, if you want to think about it that way. I don't think I have a slide on Ireland. So if I don't think I do, I'll mention that at the end. I'll very briefly go over Ireland at the end. I'm not going to...
You can see at the very least also that South Africa, East Africa, and India are all these kind of key naval ports too. For trade routes.
South Africa for the Cape, East Africa for the. He also talks about Egypt. I don't have a slide on Egypt. For the Suez Canal, and India as a sort of like station on the way to East Asia. Yeah. Britain is very good at picking up strategic places, right? Gibraltar, Suez. Yeah.
Renegade has a question. Can the buffer fringe become empires, or are they relegated to just being a buffer? Can a civilization be elevated out of the buffer zone?
Yeah, so Quigley
Become a
talks
world
about
power?
this in The Evolution of Civilizations. India has, I think, 2 or 3 civilizations that form out of it. The buffer fringe is relative to the great powers of the time. India, the Northwest Territory of India, there's this thing in the 19th century called the Great Game, which is between British and Russian espionage services, and they're vying for power, and they're spying, and they're killing one another's tribal allies and things like that. So India is like a kind of a buffer state, in not geographically in between Britain and Russia, but it's a buffer state between those two. The Ottomans are a buffer state insofar as European powers want to carve it up, and as long as the Ottomans survive, it's acting as a buffer between their possessions. But yeah, the buffer state is not, the buffer zone is not a fixed location. It's more of a concept. It just so happens at this time that these areas are the buffer zone. One of the things I want to talk about in a later episode is this idea that we have this very fixed sort of idea of the empire and what it meant, and the culture that went on with it. And I think it's actually very, very wrong. So there's a lot of work to be done on the empire, especially the late empire, and the cultural movements that are going on. And Quigley talks about it from a political angle and the sort of the set of relationships that are going on. I think that there's also, though, an aspect of it that Quigley doesn't deal with, which is very religious and moral, and actually, weirdly, surprisingly, super occult. And those intellectual lineages are what we're living with today. We're living with the direct descendants of them. And they get started in the British Empire. I actually am kind of super anti-British Empire in a lot of ways. My view of the British is much more complicated than I alluded to earlier. The British Empire is this great thing, but around 1860, which is around there's this huge Indian rebellion, and after that, the British Empire changes, and it loses a lot of the good aspects of it. There's a lot to say about this. I'm not going to tell you about it anymore, but as a little teaser for something that will come eventually, I'm going to really dig into the sort of all the things that we're living with today and how they got their start under the British Empire, the bad British Empire. So Quigley says the British Empire was this this is a little bit of what I'm talking about, is this charitable enterprise. It is not out there. There are individuals acting within the British Empire to enrich themselves. The British are no longer acting to enrich themselves. There's this very frustrating idea. I still like the Empire, despite I think there being very bad things about it from say 1890 onwards. The Americans should, in the Second World War, very much say, we don't want to defend, we don't want to recapture or defend British and French imperial possessions. We're here to bring democracy to the people. They don't understand what the British were doing in India from 1890 onwards. The British, the empire is a net drain on the British at this point in economic terms. Okay, you might say that, like, well, they're buying strategic locations for themselves. I guess there's something to that, but the British are pumping a huge amount of money out into the empire. And this is something really weird. It's going to be very counterintuitive to everything, especially the basic American idea of what an empire is. It gave India free schooling before people in Britain had free schooling. This backfired on them. The Indians are the most ungrateful people on the planet. The Indians should be thanking their lucky stars that the British showed up and toppled the Mughal Empire, because prior to the British getting there, what India consisted of was independent principalities being terrorized by roving bands of Muslim horsemen, extorting them. And the British showed up and said, no, enough of that. We're going to bring stability. We're going to bring trade. We're going to get rid of these awful aspects of the caste system. And we're gonna help you. And out of this sort of like do-goodery that happens, especially from like the late 1800s onwards, you have this system where the British are very worried about, very concerned with the Indian people. And one of the mistakes they make is they set up universities and secondary schools for the Indians. They should have only set up primary schools to help develop an Indian workforce. Because what happens is they set up universities, and the people that go to the universities are not disadvantaged people. They're very, very, very rich, well-educated Indians. And the first thing that they do is they just start agitating against the British. There's a lot of reason to think that the regular Indian had no interest in seeing the British leave. They had no desire in seeing the British leave. It's for assholes like Gandhi. Yeah, Gandhi was an asshole who want to see the British leave for very self-destructive purposes. And Gandhi says this, that at a certain point, Gandhi says, the British need to leave, and if that means that India collapses, it's something to this effect. If that means that India collapses, so be it. I'd rather have India like collapse than have the British stay. So the British are very, very charitably minded. Are you clearing your throat for a
There's
question?
that revolution coming from the upper crust of society again.
Exactly.
We're going to clip that for YouTube Shorts.
Send it to all your Indian nationalist friends. Now, the way I characterize the British Empire in this period is it was a trust. There's this paper that's generated called the Devonshire White Paper. The Duke of Devonshire is I believe he's the foreign minister at the time, and it becomes known as, or he's the Commonwealth minister, whatever that was called at the time. It might have been like imperial minister. I can't remember what. Anyway, the Duke of Devonshire is associated with this white paper that gets produced. White paper is a policy paper, and the Devonshire White Paper is formative for the future of the empire. It's written in the 1920s. And what the Devonshire White Paper says is that, and again, this is unlike any concept, especially an American audience has of anything to do with the empire. I went through the American education system. I know what's said about like kingdoms and empires, and it's so stupid. It is so. I would have been better off not going to school than listening to what they had to teach in an American school system. It is so stupid. And that's not an attack on progressives, American liberals. It's also an attack on American conservatives. Because you guys are just as dumb as the liberals. Because you think that this like American republic was ever going to work and that it isn't run by Freemasons and occultic figures. And you sit there and you hear about the British Empire and go, well, thank God we got rid of the king and the British and whatever. The British are incredibly fair-minded in everything that they do, and they always show up and they're trying to cultivate a fair system for all involved, including the indigenous people. And that's one of the reasons why you get the American Revolution. Because the settlers go, you're mean because you won't let us move into Indian land. And the British are sitting there going, yeah, but we signed this treaty with the Indians. You have to respect the law. And the Americans going, no, we don't care. We're just going to go and be settlers. And the British trying to prevent that is a big cause of the American Revolution. What the Devonshire White Paper says is very similar to this, which is that anywhere that there's a British possession, the government of that possession has to be done in the indigenous people's interests, first and foremost. And what they're thinking about is Kenya. The Devonshire White Paper is specifically about Kenya, but it establishes this precedent. And it says that when European or Indian or Arab interests, because those three groups, as well as the native Kenyans, when those three groups' interests conflict with the local Africans, we have to rule in favor of the local Africans. We're running this country until the people are educated and able to run it for themselves. And we're not going to just let Kenya get pillaged by Indians, Arabs, and Europeans. And this frustrates the people on the ground. And in many ways, I think it was the British shooting themselves in the foot by doing the right thing. So this trust is the British Empire in quotes trust, and by trust you know what I mean, like a legal instrument that is something run for someone who is not competent to run it for themselves.
Like a trust fund.
Yeah. This trust was influenced by a group of men who are incredibly nobly minded. But their noble-mindedness and this pursuit of being fair and equitable is terrible for the empire, because it allows guys like Gandhi to rise up, and they end up being one of the lessons of Quigley is everything contains within itself the seeds of its own destruction. The British Empire contained within itself the seeds of its own destruction by being fair, by being Christian, because they are explicitly saying like we've got to be Christian to these people. They allow themselves to be taken advantage of, and they allow the British Empire to be taken advantage of. And they make enemies out of the people who are actually holding the empire together. And like General Dyer, who is no relation to Jay Dyer that I know of, and General Dyer is accused of this massacre. This is a pretty big lie. General Dyer, what happens is in the city of Amritsar, an English woman's raped by an Indian, or by a mob, I think, and this, which is happening today, guys. You know, a mob raped two Christian women. A Hindu mob raped two Christian women in India like a week ago. So they like mob raping out there, and General Dyer was furious, and to an extent, he did kind of overreact in that he said any Indian who wants to go up and down the street that she was raped on has to crawl on his belly, and because he wanted to humiliate them. And this crowd of Indians gathers and protests and surrounds General Dyer. And General Dyer has with him some Gurkhas. Now, if you want to agitate against the British, I highly recommend that you agitate against actually British soldiers, because the Gurkhas don't care. The Gurkhas are Britain's break in case of emergency, because the Gurkhas will do whatever they're told with a smile on their face, and they will slit your throat ear to ear, and they won't care. Whereas a British soldier might actually have some sort of qualms about it. And Dyer is surrounded. This crowd surrounds him. Thousands surround him, and they start throwing stones. And in the moment decides to give the order to fire into the crowd in order to break it up, because if he fears for his life and he fears for the life of his men, and they fire into the crowd, and I can't remember how many die, and he gets and he doesn't get the support of the British government. The British government come down on him like a ton of bricks. And they ship him back home. He's court-martialed. He's found innocent, but his career is over. And it's this very difficult problem of what was he supposed to do? How are you supposed to run an empire? And these guys in Britain sitting there thinking, guys like Lionel Curtis and Philip Kerr, who I will talk about in future episodes, sitting there going, oh, these poor Indians, oh, we just need to treat them as Christians and they'll rise to the occasion. And they give them the space, but then, of course, they don't rise to the challenge. That's one of the big lessons of the late British Empire. This group, the Milner group, trying to give people the opportunity to rise to the occasion, and them taking the good bits of that and ignoring all the responsibilities. And so the empire just falls apart because Quigley writes the Anglo-American establishment in 49 or 48. So he doesn't have the benefit of seeing what happens over the next 20 or 30 years to the empire. And that, I don't know, I hate to put it this way. I don't know what India has to be proud of. Since 1947, I really don't know, as an Indian, what there is to be proud of. They haven't done anything. They've only ruled in their caste interests, which was something that the British were trying to get them to give up, to rule over the community and not just in the interest of castes. Anyway, and I talk about these guys, Milner, Lionel Curtis, Philip Kerr, there's a bunch of them. And I don't think the British Empire is entirely a failure in this ability. I've said to Jeff many times, I see Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia in particular as incredible bright spots of what happens when the British Empire showed up. It found a group of people who were actually interested in thriving, and how they worked with and adopted what worked about the British Empire. I don't know if you want to say anything about that, Jeff.
Well, one thing that Indians will tell you that they're very proud of is the 2011 World Cricket Championship.
Yeah. I mean, they still don't. I don't want to go there, but it's obligatory. There are still hundreds of millions of people in India who do not use toilets. They go and they shit in the fields. And it's not because they don't have toilets. It's because they don't like toilets. They think toilets are unsanitary. And there's all these diseases in India that are preventable from using a toilet. And Western charities show up and they give them the toilets, and they also give them the medicine to cure the diseases. Well, you got to stop doing one of those two things, right? And I would rather at what point are people responsible for their behavior? I don't know. The British government sends millions of pounds to India a year, and it just so happens to be roughly what the Indian government spends on its space agency each year. I don't know why the British government's sending foreign aid to a country that has a space agency, let alone one that isn't even good. Because I remember, like, there was this worry a few years ago that India had, like, destroyed an entire level of, like, the atmosphere with debris because one of its rockets blew up at, like, exactly the place you wouldn't want it to blow up, because now all that debris is up there forever. And so, like, you can't, it's a lot more dangerous to put satellites up there than it was before. Now, also, part of me goes, based. I hate satellites and all that stuff. So, thank you, India. But that's just, like, I don't know. I don't know what there, I really don't know what there is good to say about India.
There could be something to be said about the temperament of a people, I guess. If you look at East Asian people, they're very much concerned with high civilization as well. And so the British Empire seems to have that alignment of interest with places like Hong Kong and Singapore.
Well,
whereas
I'm going to say this in the next slide is China, right? I'll click there. We'll tell you about this in a minute. The Chinese have an appreciation of social mobility in a way that India prevents with the caste system.
Oh, that's an interesting point, yeah.
But go on.
Yeah, I mean, that was basically my point. With the Indian people, their concerns are not necessarily that, right?
It's the problem of dharmic religions, which is like, hey, this is your karma. And the extent to which you should actually better your situation is sort of debatable, because maybe it's your karma to be an untouchable. Now let me give you.
That's interesting though, because China is very predominantly Buddhist. And I believe in this concept.
Now I hate to argue with you because you know more about it than I do. But would you not say that China is more fundamentally Confucius than Buddhist?
Yeah, I think so.
And I think that Confucius attitude is lends itself to social mobility.
Mm-hmm.
So, if I can give you a little white pill, it will not be long before they won't be a majority, but the single largest religion in India will be Christian in the not too distant future. Because, and I always make this point to people, imagine being an untouchable and someone comes along to you and says, you're not untouchable. God loves you as much as he loves the highest caste Brahmin. I don't know why every untouchable is not a Christian. Maybe because we haven't told them about it yet. But yeah, I cannot wait to see the death of Hinduism. I am a Hindu disrespecter. I do not like Hinduism. And if you want to know more about that, I suggest you read Father Seraphim Rose, Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future.
Yes. And on the Confucian point, Confucius was very concerned with the cultivation of this the spirit of man, and also concerned with divine law, right? What is eternally true for all people?
Yeah. Rather
than this whole.
It's not just Confucius. There's Master Mozi has this bit. I was reading it in a book about Chinese history, and I read it and I was like, what am I reading? This does not read like what I thought would be Chinese. This reads like something from the Bible, and it's about a creator God who loves us all It's a really remarkable. It's a really remarkable piece of writing, and I can never find it when I want it. But yeah. It's China's not what you think it is. China's very complicated. It's not all confusion. And the Jesuits showed up and they go, we couldn't have asked for a better philosophy to have for Christians to convert than Confucianism. There's something about like Confucianism and Catholicism lining up very well together, and Taoism and Orthodoxy lining up very well together. And I don't know what the Protestant equivalent is, but yeah. So okay, China. There's 3 levels. There's the imperial, the bureaucracy, and the peasant. There's quite an opportunity for social mobility, and it pivots around that bureaucracy, because the bureaucracy is meritocratic, at least in theory, and at least at the beginning, when it's based upon exams. So if you're a smart peasant and you take the exams and you do well, you can move up. It does become a little bit sort of rigid later on, as it just becomes about ancient texts that peasants don't have quite the same ability to read. And Quigley says that in America there's like this 3-generation arc of, one generation makes the money, one generation keeps the money, one generation loses the money. And he says in China it's probably more like 6 generations, where one generation climbs up, one generation is a peasant, the next is a bureaucrat, the next is in the imperial administration, his son is in the imperial administration, and then his sons start to fall, bureaucracy, and then back to the peasants. And you have a lot of families in China apparently who were peasants who could trace like an ancestor back to the imperial administration. It was not like crazy for that to happen. But there isn't, in this period of like the 19th century, there isn't an incentive for China to develop efficiencies. Quigley talks a lot about agriculture. In sparsely populated Western countries, at the time, you're not really worried about the soil. China always has a lot of people on not a lot of land and has to really worry about the soil. So the extra manpower required to farm in a soil-friendly way is always in China's interests to do it. Another example is there's a quote. There's an anecdote about Friedman. I don't know if it's true. Milton Friedman, where he goes to China and the communists are really happy to have him, because the communists at the time are always trying to show people how well they're actually doing with the economy. And they take him around, and they take him to a tractor factory, and they show him all the tractors. And then the next day they take him out to this works project where there's a bunch of guys digging a canal with shovels. And Friedman says to them, "Why are you building them with shovels? Why are you digging it with shovels? Why aren't you using any of those tractors you showed me yesterday?" And the Chinese official says, "Well, because this is a works project." And Friedman says, "Well, in that case, why don't you take away the shovels and give them spoons?" China always has a lot of manpower, and it doesn't need to do things in the most efficient ways in regards to manpower. The other thing...
I guess to be fair, you could argue that the shovels are a happy medium.
Sure. The other thing is that in terms of this administration, this 3-layered administration, the 3-layered system, any efficiencies will benefit the bureaucracy. And neither the imperial side or the peasantry actually want that. The peasantry, it means they'll have to give more to the bureaucracy. And the imperial means it'll be more dependent upon the bureaucracy. So Europe
so that spandrel, high-low versus the middle.
Yeah.
Another manifestation of it, yeah.
And so Europe comes along, and it's inefficient. Its farming and industry are inefficient. But here's the problem: Europe would not allow tariffs to be put on its goods. So the Chinese can't protect themselves. They can't protect their inefficiencies. So they become dependent upon Europe. And the Chinese system starts to break down, and it increasingly becomes dominated by regional power brokers and warlords. And you see this in that period of, the rise of Chiang and Sun Yat-sen and those kind of guys. Chiang is debatable that I don't think he ever really runs the country. He runs whatever city he's in. Is it Shanghai? And then once you kind of get outside of Shanghai, it's very chaotic, and whoever's the most powerful sort of is in control. We're on the very last slide here, pretty much. Japan. Japan's really interesting. It adapts Western technology into Japanese culture once Admiral Perry shows up and forces Japan to open up. It does a really good job at taking on this Western technology and using it to its advantage, and for a reason that comes in a minute. It's much more fixed socially than China is. It's much more caste based, but it works in a way that India doesn't work. I don't know why, but it just works. One of the reasons it's so quick to adapt Western technology is that when Japan's a closed system, it's able to it doesn't have to worry about being outcompeted by Europeans, because nothing European is really coming in. But when it's opened up, it is incredibly incentivized to develop really quickly. But it doesn't have any resources to do that with. So it has to develop a value-added economy. So that they take in resources, they do stuff to the resources, and then they re-export them. This is a great way of making Europe your competitor, because that's exactly what Europe's doing at the time. But 1 second, we'll come right back to that. Out of this comes these two groups, the Zaibatsu and the Genro. The Genro are the elder statesmen, the power behind the throne, the power behind the government, and they're sort of political. The Zaibatsu are the great companies, and these two are really linked together. So the Genro often come out of the Zaibatsu. I think maybe one or two of the representatives on the Genro was from the Zaibatsu. These are a really Japanese thing. They're dynastic, but also have a lot of loyalty to them from the people underneath them. You still have the concept of the salaryman, the guy who gives his life to a company and works there for his whole career, and works 14 hours a day. And when he goes on holiday, he goes to a company resort with his family, and this is formed in this period, this loyalty, because they lose in the Meiji Restoration, they lose this loyalty to their clans, and so these guys sort of turn to the Zaibatsu, and that sort of fills that gap. Now, Japan is really good at this because it absolutely annihilates Russia in the Russia-Japanese War. And the Kaiser, the German Kaiser's this is terrible. I know Russia's my rival, but it's really bad that an Asian nation has just defeated a European nation. There's the Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese fleet annihilates a Russian fleet that has sailed around the world. The Russian Atlantic fleet sails around Europe, Africa, because the British are allied to the Japanese. The British won't let it through the Suez, so it has to go around Africa, It goes around Africa, it goes through the Malaysian Straits, and it goes up, and it makes this incredible voyage. Only for just as it shows up, the Japanese are waiting, and they destroy it. The Japanese Navy is incredibly good. It is largely built by the British. It's trained by the British. In fact, all the orders were given in English at the Battle of Tsushima. By the Second World War, that British lineage still survives, so that all the commands on the bridge of a Japanese battleship or warship in the Second World War were still given in English. So it's in a way, and the British sit there very satisfied with this result, because it's a great reflection of British training, equipment, and strategy. And the Japanese are really well placed. And then, of course, in the First World War, they snap up all of Germany's Pacific possessions, or at least some of them. And that's the buffer fringe. I didn't talk about Ireland. Ireland is not very interesting. It's not interesting for any strategic purposes, for any like big picture purposes. The Irish are agitating for home rule, and it very quickly spins into like no, just total independence from Britain. There isn't really anything interesting to say about Ireland ever, let alone in this context. So, yeah, there isn't much to say there. Next episode, it's the First World War. We'll be building off of this and episode 2 quite a bit, and it'll be largely, this idea of like, well, the world ended in 1914 in a lot of ways. No, it didn't. World War I, Quigley says, it didn't make anything happen that wasn't going to happen eventually anyway. So there's a little bit of like a gray pill there, like, oh, should I like not be so doomer about what the First World War did to the world? I don't know. You'll have to make your mind up. And that's it. That's the episode. Jeff, did you have any questions?
Our old friend Fish has a comment. He says that Dharmic cultures emphasize personal peace as their worldly goal rather than actualization in the Western sense. So even if social mobility is reduced in these cultures, perhaps the social contentment is worth the price. So there's always this interesting tension. It's like, how much of the world do you accept, versus how much do you seek to change? It's true. Like Westerners do take that like the opposite extreme of the spectrum too far, oftentimes.
Yeah, the chapter's not really about Dharmic religion. I mean, what Fish says is interesting in that, like, you might want to say that the Abrahamic religions are low time preference, and Dharmic religions are high time preference. That like peace in the here and now rather than salvation later. So.
Yeah, you could look at it as Christianity has always been this very intergenerational project, right?
Yeah.
That, we're always working towards the kingdom of heaven, and we have assurance that long-term vision is what we're working towards. Whereas with the Dharmics, it's like, I got to get the good karma this life, and then, I mean, in their view, you don't even remember what happens, but
I don't even know if it's like you gotta get the good karma so much as like you just gotta like pay the karmic toll.
Yeah. We have to like resolve the karmic debt. Right?
Yeah.
So it's a life to life type of project.
Any other questions from the chat? I haven't been looking at chat. I'm only looking at it now. I see Yasuko was in here. Well, I'll just say if you're watching this on the recording, we'll put up when the next one's going to be soon. Probably the same time spot. Not sure. I don't know. Jeff and I will have to figure it out. Not sure if next week or the week after. But if you like this, try and get a in for the next one. And if you got a question, I guess if you message, if you put a message on the Discord, if you're in the Discord, or if you want to message us on Twitter at the Iron Age Archive Twitter, that would be a good way, which is just at Iron Age Archive.
Oh, it's not called Twitter anymore, by the way.
It's still called Twitter. It just doesn't have a bird logo.
Yeah. Well, they're trying to change. They're trying to merge it all into one mega app.
Yeah, I don't know how I feel about these like meta spaces thing.
Oh yeah, and Renegade reminds everybody to please join the Iron Age Discord if you're interested in learning more about these kinds of topics that we delve into.
Yeah.
Put the link in the description. And I'm very much looking forward to the shorts that come out of today's lecture. And hopefully people watch the shorts and share the shorts, because that'll really help.
Yeah. Don't forget to like, comment, or subscribe. Smash that notifications button. We gotta whore ourselves out for the likes. But yeah, cool. All right. Shall I stop it there?
Yep.
All right. See you guys later. Thanks for coming, and hope to see you next time. It's bye from me. Go on, Jeff. You're supposed to say goodbye.